because in the most yourself.
Welcome back, Alistair Campbell, Carmichael, who's been having terrible slip there, who's been having a few challenges with digital technology. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Chris Whitehouse. I'm going to ask you again, if you're not invited to speak by the chair, could you please put your microphone on mute now, as we are getting feedback. Secondly, just to explain that I am chair of the Whitehouse Consultancy, who serve as political advisors to the grassroots campaign organisation Fight for Freedom, Stand with Hong Kong. And we're absolutely delighted to be doing this joint webinar with the Liberal Democrats, particularly the young Liberal Democrats, to explain more about the situation in Hong Kong and how people can help Hong Kongers in their time of need. I'm still getting feedback. Could you please put your microphones on mute? Thank you. We have Alistair Carmichael, who's going to take the chair of the event, and we're hoping to be joined by the Liberal Democrat front bench Foreign Affairs spokesperson too, Layla Moran, in due course. We also have your colleague Callum Robertson here from the Young Liberal Democrats, co-chair, who's going to be taking part. And you'll see one of the screens is blocked out except for the logo, Fight for Freedom, Stand with Hong Kong. And that is a young guy called Francis, who is a genuine Hong Konger. But for security reasons, he cannot show his face, and you'll find that his voice is also scrambled. So do bear with him if he sounds like he's been sniffing helium all evening at some student party. But he has some very serious messages for you despite that. 2 or 3 housekeeping points now, if I may. If you have questions, please enter them into the chat room along with your name, if you're prepared to give it, and roughly where you are in the country. That's the chat bubble, which on my screen is in the bottom right-hand corner. Finally, this meeting is being recorded for subsequent broadcast on digital media, including on the Whitehouse website, on Facebook and YouTube, and I'm quite sure that the Liberal Democrats and the Young Liberal Democrats will want to use it on their social media and digital platforms too. So that's enough from me for now. I hand over to Alistair to take us through the rest of the evening. Thank you.
Very much, and thank you, Consultancy, for everything pulled together in a session. I will just. We've got, I think, 270 people registered for this seminar, and I don't know how many we've actually got online, but I tell you that just so that you understand the importance of being mute, because if we've got 270 people making just a little bit of noise in the background, then pretty soon the whole thing just doesn't work. So please, I can see on my screen who's muted and who's not. And at this stage, I'm not going to name and shame anyone, but don't rely on that necessarily remaining the case indefinitely if it becomes difficult. Please just check the microphone icon for yourselves and make sure that you are unmuted. When it comes to the point that we've heard our 3 speakers, we will move into then a question and answer session. And at that point, we will unmute you, or you can unmute yourselves. And if you could maybe indicate in the chat function that you have a question to ask, I will moderate the discussion at that point. So just a few thoughts by way of introduction. First of all, a little bit of context for tonight's discussion. The title of it, I see it was originally badged as The Death of Democracy, which I thought was a little bit overblown, and I see it's now The Decline of Democracy, because, of course, as we approach this, let's not forget that this is dealing with part of her imperial colonial past, and that what you had in Hong Kong for 1997, the handover, was something which was far from being democratic. So, as always, when we deal with our own past in parts of like this, I think it's important that we approach the matter with a measure of humility. And remember also, we agreed in the Joint Declaration in 1984 to have this long period of two countries, two systems, one country. And it was about allowing Hong Kong the opportunity to find our own space and to work from one system to another. That was how she chose to go. Also remember that when we talk about China and the Chinese Communist Party in relation to Hong Kong, this is just one very important aspect of current Chinese policy. You can't just look at it in isolation. You look at the relationship between mainland China and Taiwan. You look at what is happening in Xinjiang province with regard to the Uyghur Muslim population. You look at it in relation to what's happening in Tibet, what we now begin to hear coming out of southern Mongolia. For us, this should not be about isolating China. We're not wanting China of the next sort of Cold War, although, be no mistake, there are people out there who very much pursue this agenda. It is something which we as Liberals believe is important, because as Liberals we are internationalists, and as Liberals the primacy of human rights is something that should underpin what we do in that sphere. So we find ourselves occasionally with some strange bedfellows in this journey. I think that's just something we have to accept. It's important that we find ourselves and we are clear about the reasons why we take the approach to this issue that we do. So we have three speakers this evening. The first of these is my good friend and colleague, Layla Moran, Member of Parliament for Oxford West and Wellington, and the Liberal Democrat for Affairs spokesperson rather. We have then a representative from the Fight for Freedom stand Hong Kong, and finally we'll have Callum Robertson, who is the co-chair of Young Liberals. It's amongst the pictures displayed in front of me, I see that there are some of those in our number have been Liberals for a number of decades. I myself, as a young Liberal quite some time ago, and it's interesting to see having various Liberal. So we'll hear from her. I hand over the Layla Moran.
Well, first of all, thank you so much, Alistair. I hope everyone can hear me okay. The connection before was a bit unsteady, so I hope this is all right. And it's lovely to see you all. I'm here, as Alistair, who sadly wasn't called, hot-footing it off a urgent question on Hong Kong in the House. And it's been very interesting seeing how Parliament, when Alistair says that there are some uncomfortable bedfellows, he's not lying. I find myself in regular conversation with the likes of Ian Duncan Smith and Bob Seeley and people like this, who I have to say on almost every other matter that I could possibly imagine, we do not agree on. And yet, interestingly, on this point, there is quite a powerful group beginning to form in Parliament that hopefully tonight in its Lord's manifestation may well deliver a government defeat on a trade bill and an amendment to that trade bill that will actually encourage the government to then adopt a stance that recognises that we don't want to be dealing with states who are complicit in genocide, which you would think would be self-evident, but nevertheless takes huge cross-party support to organise. So what I thought I'd do in the few minutes that I have is just to outline some of the work that we're trying to do in the House at the moment. And I would be absolutely remiss not to mention the work that Alistair has been doing on this subject for many, many years. He's too modest to say, but I very much stand on the shoulders of Alistair, if not giants, but nevertheless, he's a tall man, so that works too. And the most important thing I think that we have to work with right now is, in fact, Alistair's bill, which is very wide-ranging. It was a 10-minute rule bill that he brought to the House, which talks not just about human rights in the context of trade. It talks also about that wider relationship with China, but it also talks about how we can practically help those Hong Kongers who need our help right now. And that urgent question in the House was about 3 democracy activists, young people who had put themselves in that position that we would all consider quite normal. They went and organised, in fact, a protest. And as a result of that, the leader, as it were, although it's a much more nebulous grassroots effort, it's worth saying, has been imprisoned for 13 months, and so have others. There are some who are already in the UK who genuinely feared for their lives and were worried that they would be rounded up and locked in a cell. And actually also, and this is very much a sign of how oppressive the state has become, they're very, very worried for their parents too. Now, the government has introduced a path to citizenship for British national overseas passport holders, which is actually more generous than we might have imagined they would have done. And they are very pleased with themselves, and quite rightly so. But one of the things that I've been campaigning on, which again is already included in Alistair's bill, is that should be extended to every Hong Konger. And there is a very, very important group of people who are missing, who cannot access this scheme. They are those who are born after 97, who don't have BNO passports. Those are the very young people who are making up the bulk of the continued pro-democracy protests that we're seeing. These are the very same young people who, when they're saying, you know, apply under a youth mobility scheme or apply using the points-based immigration system, they can't afford it. These are the very people who are standing up for what we believe in Hong Kong. And whilst the government's offer is very generous, by their own numbers, it covers roughly 5 of the 7 million people who they were expecting it would. But there's still 2 million people who are not covered. And that's what we are actively working on right now to try and change. Because my view is that if you are someone who is willing to stick your neck out for democracy, if you're someone who this country has promised we would look after, then we should be holding the government to that promise, no matter who they are or what age they happen to be. And I met with the minister on this last week. I've got a further meeting now with the Home Office Minister to talk through these visa schemes. And my view is that we need to be very, very practical in the help that we're offering young people in Hong Kong right now, because that in the immediate term is the thing that's going to make the most difference. But to the slightly medium and longer term, I just want to say it is absolutely, I think, right that our party stands at the heart of standing up for human rights. We are internationalists. We believe in the international rule of law. We believe in human rights. There are problems with that international system, not least that because China has a veto at the UN. That is a real issue when it comes to, for example, for having a definition of genocide put on what it's doing to the Uyghur population. But there is also a bigger geopolitical problem right now. How do we deal with China, given that we rely on them? Just look over the last few months, COVID-19, the masks that we are wearing to keep ourselves safe, much of the equipment that we rely on, so much of our economy is tied. And I even reflect on the fact that I do have an HSBC bank account, and I am considering whether that is something that I want in my short-term future, because right now I'm very, very, very uncomfortable with the way that they are behaving and the way that they are beholden to the Chinese state. And what I will say is that I do think we need a coherent party approach to China. That is something that I don't think we should be working on slowly. It's something that we need to bring the whole party around, and I think needs to be considered carefully with Alistair, with our partners in the Lords, with the wider party as well. But at its centre should be the international rule of law and human rights. So I'll stop there and pass back to you, Alistair. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. A presentation the issues for us as Democrats beautifully. So thank you, Layla. We'll come back to you for the questions. Part of my now with the democracy movement in Hong Kong comes by virtue of my being co-chair along with Natalie Bennett of the Greens of the all-party parliamentary group for Hong Kong. Earlier this year, we did a report into the policing of protests last year, and the treatment in particular of those who were administered humanitarian assistance. There was really as I was this to me is release that once you know what's happening, you can't turn away and you can't walk away from it. And that's why I am delighted and indeed privileged to invite our next speaker to speak to us. That is Francis. Francis will be speaking behind screen for reasons that you will understand, and he and Hong Kong. So many welcome, and we you have.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Alistair. Hello all. I'm Francis, and I'm the spokesperson for Fight for Freedom, Stand Up Hong Kong. Let me briefly introduce to you all what Stand Up Hong Kong is. Stand Up Hong Kong is a crowd-funded, grassroots lobbying advocacy organizations, and we are, after the implementation of the national security law in Hong Kong, we are the last remaining grassroots organization that is based in the UK, in the US, and in the EU, representing the voice of Hong Kongers. As I'm sure many of you are aware, the severity of the national security law. When China implements the national security law in Hong Kong without the consent of Hong Kongers, in the 30th of June this year, it has changed every aspect of life in Hong Kong. The national security law is a very horrible piece of legislation to the extent that it really Hong Kong's life, but not if in politics. The extent of the national security law is actually beyond areas that one normally would think. For example, the NSL, it enshrines 4 very fake and broadly defined charges in the Hong Kong legal system. And these are secessions, terrorism, subverting state power, and colluding with foreign political forces. So in any normal political democratic country, secession is, the terrorism. These are okay, as we would expect any normal country would have laws to govern these kind of activities, which is perfectly all right. But on the context of NSL in Hong Kong, what is different is that it's very vague, and it applies not just to Hong Kongers in Hong Kong, but Hong Kongers abroad. And this is why it's a serious thing, because it's not just applying to the Hong Kongers abroad. It also applies to people who are not from Hong Kong, and who are not in Hong Kong, but are abroad. So, for example, if I'm speaking to a young Liberal member tonight who is showing solidarity with Hong Kong, who's wanting to support the Hong Kong protest, but he's not necessarily a well-known person in, let's say, in the UK. If he happens to be in Hong Kong or in transit in Hong Kong, he can be arrested by the national security law, because the national security law covers the entire planet Earth, not just in Hong Kong. And obviously, we do believe that the Chinese are probably not going to use that against the foreign nationals, but I think what we are seeing here is the extent of the national security law. It's beyond the territory of Hong Kong, and really shows that China is so determined not just to silence people with different opinions in Hong Kong, but to implement an iron fist in the rule of Hong Kong. And that has changed everything in Hong Kong in terms of the promise made by China in the 1984 Sino-British Joint Declaration, and most importantly, the framework that China promised to Hong Kong, one country, two systems, which is allowing Hong Kong to enjoy a high degree of autonomy, to continue Hong Kong's way of life as it's before the handover after China took over. So to respond to that, the EU government has introduced a BNO visa scheme, which Layla Moran MP has just briefed the audience tonight. The situation in Hong Kong is not getting better. And in terms of the UK government responses, BNO visa is important, but we do believe there are more things that the UK government can do. And most importantly, will be a collective responses with other sectors, including the United States, in terms of sanctions. Now, the United States is the first country in the world to impose sanctions on China and Hong Kong officials in relation to the national security law and the erosion of Hong Kong's autonomy. The UK has passed its Magnitsky-style sanctions legislations, and the first round of Magnitsky sanctions has been applying to Russian officials who were responsible for the murder of Sergei Magnitsky, which is a Russian lawyer, and that's where the namesake is coming from. But however, we are continuing pressuring the governments, the UK governments, to apply sanctions to Hong Kong, not just on individuals and on the famous individuals in terms of government officials, but in slightly less famous officials, for example, people in the police force or mid-rank ministerial people in the Hong Kong government, because lots of Hong Kongers, despite the fact they're working for the Hong Kong government and showing their loyalty to the Chinese government, they're very honest with their money and their assets. They have lots of assets and a lot of money in the UK. And it is very true that the sanction is very effective. I mean, Nelson Mandela famously said, the sanctions helped to bring down the apartheid regime in South Africa. He said, certainly, yes, it plays an important role. Now, of course, we understand that when it comes to China, this giant bully, it's not that straightforward. However, when you're targeting officials who thought that they had the state protection, who thought that they could work under the protection of the Chinese communist state, sometimes sanctions and freezing their assets in the UK, in the West, is the most powerful tool. And that's something that we will continue to work on, especially with the Liberal Democrats. Last but by no means least, the Liberal Democrats a good friend with Hongkongers. Liberal Democrats is one of the first party in the parliaments to be very vocalised on Hong Kong, and particularly the late Lord Ashton. He was an excellent champion in defending Hong Kongers' rights. Back in 1997, when Hong Kong was handed over to China, the late Paddy Ashton, he was one of the first people who questioned then a Conservative government, first Margaret Thatcher and John Major, on the VNO passport, because it was the decision made back then that Hong Kong dependent territory citizens who were practically British were not given the rights to full citizenship. And you can already foresee that this will create, first it's unfair, and this will also create a political crisis in the future. Lord Ashton was pioneered in his area. We do miss him very much, and we are all very inspired by his courage to speak out and to defend Hong Kongers. So this evening, I hope that we can continue this conversation, continue the strong traditions of the Liberal Democrats being a strong friend, a good friend to Hong Kongers. And on behalf of South Hong Kong and all the Hong Kongers who cannot speak tonight, we thank you. We thank the Liberal Democrats for being a strong defender of for the people of Hong Kong and a strong defenders of liberal and democracy. Thank you.
Francis, thank you very much. I turned off, just turned it back on briefly. I don't know if it makes any difference to the quality of sound. The suggestion from a few people is that out the bandwidth. So if you could maybe try that, that would be enormously helpful. Aren't. Understand we dance around the cusp of my ignorance here when we talk about how you eke out bandwidth and the like. So it may work, it not. We will try. Panel speaker this evening, though, is the co-chair of the Young Liberals, Callum Robertson. So Callum, thank you for the role of Young Liberals working with Hong Kong and the Whitehouse Consultancy in bringing this together this evening. And Callum will be the third and final panelist before we go to the question and answer session, for which I'm still looking for questions that you can put in chat. So Callum, thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Alistair. First of all, thank you to the Whitehouse Consultancy and the Liberal Democrats for inviting me to speak tonight on behalf of the Young Liberals. It's really important that we as the Young Liberals, and actually more widely as the Liberal Democrats, are always strong and put liberal, human rights-led foreign policy at the heart of what we do. As we saw with the Iraq War and with the Kosovo conflict, we can long-term win the argument when we're at the heart of the argument, giving the argument forward. And I think that's that's more prevalent now more than ever in relation to the actions of the Chinese government. Not just in relation to Hong Kong. Alistair and I, a couple of months ago, did a big piece, a similar webinar on the plight of the Uyghur Muslims. So in Xinjiang, in Tibet and Taiwan as well, we see the Chinese Communist Party, the Chinese government, riding roughshod over the human rights of anyone they feel they can. And we do need to take a strong stance on this. And as the Young Liberals, we've made really positive steps. So just two of the examples of sort of practical things we've done is the Young Liberals have passed motions at our conference, and we've led on work within the European Young Liberals with LIMEC, so that's the European Young Liberal organisation, condemning the actions of those involved in human rights abuses in China. But there's more we must do. The other speakers have rightly referenced Magnitsky-style sanctions. They've got to be applied to the officials responsible for the deprivation of democratic processes in Hong Kong. And we've got to go further, though. I think we need to reassess our entire relationship with Beijing. And I think we should start at home. We should start with human rights impact assessments. when it comes to, as our House of Lords group is arguing tonight, trade deals, when it comes to the awarding of public sector contracts, when it comes to our foreign relations. I think every time something that the government has some form of role in, the UK government has some form of role in, comes up in relation to China or relation to Gulf human rights abusing states, we need to make sure that we are standing there going, well, what is the human rights implication of what we're doing? And I know this work that Layla and Alistair do fantastically. We have historically been a party of free trade. And we are now proudly to this day still. But trade ceases to truly be free when one state, in this situation, China, uses it as a cover to enslave their own people and enslave the people of Hong Kong. It's wrong, and it's terrifying because Layla mentioned the 1997 cut-off point. For those who don't know, I was born in 1998. If I was born in Hong Kong, I wouldn't be eligible. And the dissent that I, as a Liberal Democrat, show to the government every day would be criminal if I was a Hong Konger. And I think that should be terrifying, and that should be our focus. Our focus should be the spreading of human rights and the spreading of freedom of expression across the world. And in that regard, the Young Liberals do stand with Hong Kong, and they stand with the Liberal Democrats. And we stand by prepared to do what we can, because we can't solve it on our own, but prepared to do what we can to further the cause of human rights across China and the wider Asia region. Thank you.
Callum, thank you very much. Knows when you've been Liberal for as long as I have been. Now, Joshua Hyde, the chat asks if he asks
Was that right that I unmute myself now, or? Yeah. Thank you very much. May I ask a question of all those who speak, and I might open a topic which I already opened, because the Young Liberals passed a motion in their summer conference to close all bank accounts they have with HSBC and Standard Chartered. However, after the new election of a new chair, there was the debate about opening TikTok accounts. Would you say this plays in line, or is it oppositional to the motion we passed? And the second might be most recent. I have friends from Hong Kong. I'm studying at an international school with students from Hong Kong, China, all over the world. I myself, I'm from Germany. And as far as I understood you, when I'm talking about them and they protested last year, and they sometimes protest, when I'm talking with them about what's going on in Hong Kong and about the protests, that I'm a risk if I have a transit or if I want to go to Hong Kong, that I get arrested. Thank you very much.
Joshua, thank you for that. About the and how we personal implications of the
Yeah, no, thank you, Alistair. To answer Joshua's question very quickly, yeah, we're taking the steps to close bank accounts with HSBC. Moreover, we're encouraging local parties in a region and states to do the same. I would completely agree there's a conflict of interest with TikTok. I mean, despite being 22, I am what could be known as a young fogey, so I'm not sure I actually understand TikTok myself. But on a serious note, I think we need to be having serious discussions about giving extra airtime to and giving our data to companies that have stakes controlled by the Chinese government. I think that would be a fundamentally unwise thing to do. Most importantly, from a security implication, as campaigners, there's a security implication in handing over your data and then campaigning against a very, very powerful state. So no, we're absolutely going to be rethinking that idea of a young Liberals TikTok just from a purely practical level.
Okay. Talk with Benson.
Alistair, you really are breaking up. Could you perhaps try turning your video feed off again?
Are you able to hear? To come in, or shall I go straight?
Sure. I'll just come in very quickly, Alistair, if I may, just because TikTok was basically the theme of my speech at conference, and I completely agree with the question that TikTok is problematic, and the reason why TikTok is problematic is because of lines that are contained in its privacy notice, but also the way that the national security law itself works, which is that all Chinese-owned companies, and it's not TikTok itself that's the problem, it's the owner of TikTok, a company called ByteDance, that is the problem. And ByteDance would be subject to the national security law. And the way the law works is that if the Chinese Communist Party and the government requests data, and they could use it for all sorts of things, you know, it could be competitive advantage, it could be democratic interference, it could be all sorts of things, but the point is we'd never know. TikTok itself says that it doesn't do this. And I've been having frantic phone calls from their public affairs people for a number of weeks now, saying, oh no, please, can we have a coffee and I will reassure you that this doesn't happen. But the thing is, the national security law, my understanding of it is that there is a line in it that also says that if you are asked if the data is being transferred to the Chinese state, then you are by law not allowed to say if it is or is not. And so I don't believe a word that's coming out of TikTok's mouth. And that's the problem. Until such time as we've got absolute assurance that companies like TikTok aren't going to be selling our data to the Chinese state, I think we do need to seriously consider the implications as a party, but also as a country, of using them. And to the general point, I think there is enormous power in the power of the consumer here, whether it be HSBC, whether it be TikTok. They need us to engage with these platforms. There are other platforms and other ways to do it. The same applies to supply chains that could be, for example, using Uyghur slave labor, which I've called out in the House. My first port of call is to say to people, well, we can wait for the government to act, but that could take a lot of time. Actually, there is something that you could literally do this evening. Someone in the chat said, give me 5 things to do. Well, like me, consider shutting down your HSBC account if you have it, but also look at the shops that could be using Uyghur slave labor. Some very high profile companies, clothes shops like H&M, Nike, and there are some actually who have since come back and said, well, we didn't realize that we were involved in the supply chain. We are changing our suppliers as a result. There's a lot you can do. And if you want, have a look on my Twitter feed, because I named and shamed all the companies on there.
Hi, can I just go quickly to a point that Joshua raised in terms of whether it's safe for him or other people going to Hong Kong? Well, let me reassure you something. I don't have the perfect answer for that. It's a fact, because the severity of the national security law and the extent and the determination of China to control people who speak against China is very strong. Though that being said, of you being a citizen, will you have severe danger or imminent risk if you go to Hong Kong or if you're traveling through Hong Kong airport? The answer is I don't think so. So as long as you're not one of these very outspoken person, your risk is relatively low, because after all, as much as China is doing everything that China is capable of to crush people who dare to speak out, they still have to pretend that they are a responsible state. They still have to pretend that they want to do business with. They want to do business with other countries, so they will, to a certain extent, respect particularly your German passport. But for people who are from Hong Kong, if you have engaged in protests in the past, I think it's fair for me to say that if you are have Hong Kong citizenship, so you have to be careful to see that what kind of risk level that you're taking. If you are involved in a very peaceful demonstration, or you're not very outspoken, and perhaps your risk is low. But for someone who have been very active or gone into the front line, then my advice would be to reconsider your prospects in Hong Kong, because it is no longer safe. Hong Kong is no longer a safe place. But for other foreign citizens, I think it's relatively safe. Of course, it's sad for me to say that to discourage people to not go to Hong Kong, because obviously I would like people to go to Hong Kong. Hong Kong is a fantastic place, it's my home. But the reality is Hong Kong is no longer the same Hong Kong as it was. And there is always underlying risk when it comes to going to Hong Kong if you are outspoken on democracy and freedom, which is, of course, unacceptable.
If I might endorse some of the things that Francis was saying there, it's important that when the all-party parliamentary group on Hong Kong, of which Alistair is one of the two co-chairs, as he mentioned at the beginning, produced a report on violence by the Hong Kong police against humanitarian aid work, the Hong Kong police themselves briefed the Hong Kong media that 11 arrests of Hong Kong Democrats were related directly to the publication of that report here in Westminster, because it called for sanctions to be imposed against the chief executive and other senior personnel within the Hong Kong administration. They also briefed against my own company, the Whitehouse Consultancy, by name for having provided Alistair and his fellow officers, with the Secretariat and administrative support to make that report possible. So the Hong Kong authorities themselves are trying to limit what Alistair, Layla, and other front benchers in the Westminster Parliament can say. And the sort of sanction that they would face, I think Francis is right. The Chinese government would be shooting itself in the foot were it to arrest Layla or Alistair. But what would be likely to happen were they to go on a pro-democracy trip to Hong Kong, perhaps to monitor elections or to meet Democrats, is that quite simply they wouldn't be allowed into the country and they'd be put on the first plane out of the country, pretty much wherever it went to. That national security law to which Francis refers and this question refers is insidious. It has a dreadful effect. It is already curbing and inhibiting what can be said by students at universities here in the UK, for fear what they say in open discussion is taken down, shared with the Chinese authorities, and risks them and their loved ones being arrested or otherwise intimidated by the security forces in Hong Kong. So whilst it may be unlikely that we'll see Layla, Alistair and myself smuggled out of the country, Chinese agents do that out of countries, and charged in a kangaroo court, that could all happen to Hong Kong citizens, but it's unlikely to happen to us. But nevertheless, the Chinese authorities have declared that their national security law in section 38 specifically applies everywhere in the world to everyone, whether they have any contact with Hong Kong whatsoever. And that is a massive curbing of free speech and free democracy everywhere in the world. Thank you.
Okay. Can I ask a question to Layla?
Sure, absolutely. And also, Chris has asked me temporarily, depending on Alistair's connection.
Sure, I'm the chair of the Liberal International for the Northwest, and I was also an overseas director of Standard Chartered Bank, based in Hong Kong. Would your remarks about the Hong Kong Shanghai Bank, your bank account, would they also be the same for Standard Chartered Bank, which is on a par with Hong Kong Bank. You know, we were Standard Chartered. The Chartered Bank was the first bank in China in 1852. So we have a longer history than the Hong Kong Shanghai. As far
well,
as
thanks, Howard. I mean, I think my comments with regards to HSBC was because I've had an HSBC account since I was 12, and so I feel very sad that in any way my money seems to be complicit in what they've done. And this week we were hearing that, you know, they have actually frozen the assets for no good reason of pro-democracy campaigners in Hong Kong. I don't know if the bank that you referred to has done the same thing. And I should say that I do make a distinction between companies that operate in China or might have been founded in China and those that do seem to be actively involved in some of these atrocities, who, when they are shown that they are involved in some of these atrocities, then do nothing about it. And as I said earlier, there are companies, clothing companies in the UK, who, upon discovering, Adidas was one of them, the well-known sports brand, that when they realized that they were part of these supply chains, changed their supply chains. And just because they had been involved once doesn't mean that I think they should be in any way boycotted forever. And I think that's the comment I would make with regards to the exercising of our personal freedoms. But there's another question here in the chat, which I actually would quite like to throw to Callum and Francis, that is linked. And it's to do with transparency. And the question says, with regard, I've lost it just for a moment. Where is it? Oh, here we are. This is from Isaac Crosby in Walsall. Young Liberals as students, should we be demanding transparency of the terms under which teaching institutions in the UK receive funding from Chinese companies or CCP affiliates? And I'd love to get the opinion of Francis and Callum,
Sure.
perhaps in the opposite order. So Callum first and then Francis on that particular issue.
So I can speak to that sort of from two perspectives. So in my day job, I work for a human rights organisation, and we've been doing some research, and you know, I'm going to call them out by name. The University of Huddersfield not just provides receives funding from countries with substandard human rights records. They actively provide training to the police forces in the form of the thing with the Bahraini government. And if you look at universities across the UK, it's scarily common for them to be engaged at some level in this sort of either funded research projects or the year abroad exchange programs being conditional on silence over human rights abuses or research output being changed, things like that. So it's like a coercive control with the with regards to how the Chinese government sort of exerts it over UK universities. Now that's obviously terrifying. How we respond, I think, should be to really remove China's power to do it. So I think it comes into how we fund higher education. If we're a lot more generous in our grants as a UK government and as devolved governments and councils, etc., we remove the financial lever that the Chinese government has over research grants, etc. So I think that's sort of the solution, as it were, to the way China tries to exert control over these sorts of issues.
Thank you so much, Callum. Francis, is there anything you'd like to add on this particular subject?
Thank you. Yes, Callum's point is absolutely spot on. It is shocking that the amount of British universities across 4 nations in our country is being partly funded by Chinese companies and Chinese projects. It's unfortunate. We do have a lot of universities in this country, and sometimes public funding might not necessarily be enough for them to support not just their research, but their survival. Particularly, we see there's a huge impact of COVID-19, and we are seeing there are universities, particularly in my understanding, there are universities in Scotland, are now struggling to actually survive because of the sudden withdrawal of a huge amounts of Chinese international students. So the impact of Chinese state on our universities is not just on research projects, but also very hard cash given to the day-to-day running of the university, being international students. And that is a problem that we cannot fix in one day. But in terms of what young people, students can do, I think it's absolutely important. Work with your student union. We notice that the Chinese embassy is planting Chinese students to get elected in student unions across the country, to not speaking for a Chinese student, but really speaking for the Chinese state. Now, we don't want to be accused that we are being xenophobic or we're trying to limit people's voice, but we do have to remember, if we're allowing people with a different agenda, an agenda that is literally promoting a fascist regime that is more than China, then we have to ask ourselves, should we give them a floor to express these kind of opinions? Now, there are limitations of what one can do, and sometimes things may not necessarily be very clear. But my suggestion to fellow students in here is that when you are in your universities, work with your student union, make sure that the student union is monitoring the university in all these projects. Sometimes they might not necessarily be very transparent, but a very important first step is make sure that when you see Hongkongese students in your university, make sure their voice is being heard, make sure they're not being intimidated by the Chinese counterparts, and make sure when there are Chinese candidates standing for election, thorough scrutiny is needed to ensure that the Chinese embassy is not infiltrating your student union, which has happened before, which is still happening, and we must put a stop to that.
Brilliant. Well, I am looking at the chat and trying to find one last question, but there isn't one. So actually, we've only got 5 minutes left. So I think it's worth going back round to our various contributors and getting sort of final words. And I first of all want to say a massive thank you to Whitehouse Consultancy for putting this on and hosting this. You are all, as interested parties who are watching, on alert. I do think that we need some more comprehensive party policy on this. You'll be delighted to hear. But I think it needs to be very much tying together all the different strands. So Hong Kong, yes, but also on Uyghurs, also on our relationship with China in the context of a changing geopolitical world. And I don't know about you, but I found myself really reflecting on this when I saw that in the recovery to COVID-19, China is already growing at 2%. And yet we look like we are just at the beginning of what looks to be a deep recession. There is most certainly a bigger geopolitical move that is happening right now. Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party are most certainly taking advantage of these big geopolitical shifts. And I think it is right and proper that as a party, we reflect on this and that we have a coherent approach that applies not just to China, but also to other parts of the world as well. So you're on notice. This is something I'd like to develop with the party over time in my role as Foreign Affairs spokes. But I wonder now if I could just go very quickly to Callum, the very brave Francis, and then the very final word, who might be able to speak to us from behind his screen, is Alistair. A big thank you to you all, especially Francis, I would say, who has so bravely come to talk to us this evening. Thank you so much. And I'll leave the final minutes to the other speakers on this call. So Callum, a very brief final thought, please.
Thank you, Layla. Yeah, it's crucial that we put human rights at the forefront of what we do internationally. And yet Layla and Alistair have been absolutely outstanding in their work on this. I think the next fights for us come in calling out companies, as we've been doing, but also developing that, as Layla says, that comprehensive approach to how we deal with both China and other human rights abuses throughout the world. The Foreign Office report on human rights concerned countries came out either last week or the week before, and it names and shames the countries. We need to have a proactive approach to dealing with them. And I think that approach has to lie in human rights impact assessments, in the same way we have equality impact assessments in councils. To go every time that we're doing a trade deal, every time a company wants to expand overseas, we tie them up, not in red tape, but we tie them up in regulation to go, we're not having it. We're not having human rights abusers making money off British consumers, because that should be a red line for us. And I think if we do that, and if we work more importantly with the rest of the world in doing that, with the new Biden administration in America and with the EU, then together we can force China to take basically a better stance. And I think that's where we've got to go next on this. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Francis.
Thank you. Thank you so much. First of all, I must show my deepest gratitude to many of you here tonight, and also to the Liberal Democrats, who has always been a very keen supporters for Hong Kong as a champion for human rights. And I think your record is a testimony for your dedication to that. So I think just touch on a very brief point in terms of, yes, we must. It's not easy. You know, China is a giant. And compared to the threats Soviet Union had to liberal democracy, you know, the effects of China is beyond that. The Soviet Union was a superpower. The Soviet Union didn't have a supply chain that's right deep into your doorstep. But China does have that supply chain right to your doorstep. It doesn't matter what you order online, it doesn't matter what company you buy, there's always something linked back to China. So it's not exactly an easy step. It's not something that we should ignore, because you know, it's hard. Doesn't mean that we shouldn't start doing it. So perhaps start questioning about supply chains, as Callum was saying, is an important step. The other thing I want to emphasise very briefly is, we will be expecting a lot of people moving to the UK from Hong Kong, as some people have asked in the chat sessions. We don't know the exact numbers yet, but the UK government is predicting for just the first year, 2021, that they're expecting more than 10,000 people, beyond Hong Kongers, will be coming to the UK. So we want to welcome them. We want to make sure that people coming from Hong Kong to the UK feel feeling being welcomed in the UK. They have some connection with the UK. Of course, they're being pre-exposed to British culture, as the historic links between Hong Kong and the UK is very strong. But nonetheless, they are moving to a new country, so we want to make sure they feel welcome. My closing remarks would be, thank you so much for everyone being here tonight. Please continue the good work that you've been doing. There are so many ways that we can engage on this topic, to engage with Hong Kongers, and we will continue to engage with the Liberal Democrats. We have very happy working relations with the Liberal Democrats, and in due course we will launch other campaigns and make sure that people are getting connected, and I look forward to speaking to you all very soon. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Francis. Virtual round of applause, I'm sure. And last word, quite rightly, should go to Alistair Carmichael, if he can unmute and speak from behind the screen. Can he? Oh, yes. Alistair, are you there? Okay. Alistair, speak now, or I'm going to take this to a close, and I'll do that by asking everyone if you can press the little reactions button and perhaps give everyone a massive round of applause. Thank you so much all for being here this evening, for joining us on Zoom. These things are never perfect in technology, but isn't it wonderful that we can have these discussions? And I think you'll all agree it's been a very useful, interesting, and at times alarming discussion. I hope you all have a lovely evening, stay safe, and farewell to you all. Thank you very much.
Thank you all.